really very accurately reflects how your jobs have changed in recent years. Nate Koechley is a senior front-end engineer, or senior designer and developer at Yahoo. He is also one of the kind of guiding forces behind the Yahoo user interface library, which he will be talking about this afternoon. But in this session, it's kind of a more general kind of step back and look at how the discipline of web design and front-end engineering, as he calls it, has changed lately. So let's turn it over to him. Nate, it's all yours, sir.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good morning. Catching a little video here of the audience. All right, hey everybody. Thank you. All right. So thanks for the introduction. Today we're going to talk about professional front-end engineering, what the heck that is, why it's important, and why I think it's exciting and important and sort of new discipline that requires focus. The last session, Lance really talked about sort of focusing on design, focusing on the interface. And I think the development of sites takes the same degree of focus. And this is really sort of emerging around the world. And in fact, I gave this talk 2 weeks ago in China, and I trusted that it says about the same thing. They sort of wrote it for me. But the point here is that it's really happening around the world and sort of industry-wide. And here's actually a video that I shot there of all the developers sort of doing the same thing. This is at an open source conference in Beijing about 2 weeks back, so they're saying hello to you too. So today we're really going to talk about why front-end engineering is distinct. And we often call it web development or web devs or stuff like this, but in the last few years we've really been trying to professionalize it and bring more attention to it and really sort of hone our craft. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's sort of a distinct a distinct kind of area of expertise and why it is so important to modern websites. We're going to talk a little bit about why it actually matters to do it at a professional level, why it's worthy of focus. And then we're going to do a quick survey of some of kind of the current methodologies, current practices that we're doing in our day-to-day work at Yahoo and that we're seeing sort of emerge across the industry. Some of those will be old hat, some of them will be new, and for some of them I hope that just by sort of articulating them here, it gives them even more credibility. Start with a story. This is where our story begins in February 1994. Before Yahoo even had an exclamation mark. The web was still small back then, and I guess people weren't that excited about it when Yahoo got started. I don't know if my pointer reaches over there, but at the very bottom you can see 31,000 links in the database. I think somebody in here probably has 31,000 feeds in their feed reader these days. So the web's come a long way. But look how simple the design is, information first. And if you're a web standards type person, it doesn't get more semantic than this, just links and an unordered list. Yahoo, circa 1996, the first image, the first two-column layout. 1998, a little bit more content, web's growing rapidly. Our first international kind of offerings, localization into different markets. The year 2000, a lot more content, but still sort of what's one thing to notice here is that it hasn't really changed that much. We've gone from one column to three, but still, it's just blue links, white background, not a lot of graphics, very straightforward, very fast, very sort of basic. This is Yahoo in 2001. So now we've gone 7 years, and there hasn't really been much change, even though we've had a this is the whole .com thing. It's, everything, the whole industry's changed, the world's changing, but web development and design has stayed relatively straightforward and static. Moving ahead a little bit, this is, I think, 2003, and then up to sort of where we are today. So let's talk a little bit about sort of what happened then. The year 2001 is sort of the middle point there that I want to focus on. Yahoo had been around for 7 years, had 3,000 employees, and 0 front-end engineers. The whole company, 3,000 employees, no web developers. How can that be? And sort of why does that matter? Because in 2001, the site was accessible to everybody, it was available, it worked just fine. But in 2008, it's still sort of accessible and available and works just fine. We've gone from font tags and nested tables and kind of static interfaces to really semantic and accessible markup at a much higher and complete level. a really rich DHTML interface with lots of AJAX behavior and just a lot more power at the user's fingertips. And a lot more content. We've got tab areas and expanding areas, and there's layers and layers of content and functionality on this same page that performs just as quickly as it did back then. Very, very plain design, and the benefit of that was that it was very predictable. Font tags worked, nested tables worked, got the job done. 2008, we've really seen a lot more demand for visual sophistication, visual fidelity, and a lot more precision. But it still has to be exceptionally dependable and solid across all these different places. Back to 2001, users, even though the whole .com run-up had happened, users still had relatively low expectations for what they could do online. And in fact, I sometimes joke that we've been really, really successful at lowering users' expectations, that they can't really double-click, that they can't drag and drop, all these things that you kind of saw in 2001. 2008, users are much more demanding, both from a visual sense and from a kind of an experience sense. 2001, Yahoo hired the first front-end engineers. We were web developers, and we were hired into the user experience and design group at Yahoo. And in 2008, there's about 750 of us spread across offices around the world. And this pattern happens, I think, at pretty much all companies. And I got to say that we're hiring. So come see me. 2001, the intersection of design and development was still sort of vague. And in fact, at Yahoo, the designers would mock up their pages, we'd do our usability testing, we'd test things in the labs, and the designers would actually write the HTML, just nest another table and add another font tag, and everything was fine, and pass it over the fence to the engineers who would sort of do it again. But sort of that intersection, the place where design and development touch, wasn't really that focused on. In 2008, we're totally focused on that. We're figuring out new techniques for getting the most bang for our buck in terms of pixels, in terms of K, page weight, other things. And really having a team focused on that, I think, has emerged as a best practice. So back then, really very few people, very few companies, and very few individuals. This is before Zeldman's book on web standards designs, before a lot of just development of the types of interfaces we see online now. We didn't really know which problems to solve, and we didn't really know that there was sort of a better way out there. So this is a quote from the executive vice president at Yahoo in charge of design. So in 2001, they started to see that JavaScript was becoming more advanced. Browsers could now support CSS more thoroughly. So they knew that the web was going to evolve, and so it was time to bring in developers to sort of make that happen, to really focus on bringing more dynamic experiences to our users. The other reason was they really wanted to have professional-grade focus on this. I mean, it's one thing to hack together a site and get it out there and just ship something. That's fine. But when you're doing big business, when you're building a website that represents most of the value of your company, you really want to do it the best you can. And so prior to this, we didn't separate presentation and behavior and content or anything else. And so the executives at Yahoo recognized that was something that needed to happen. So I've been there since 2001. I've been on one of the early web developers they hired and helped sort of grow and define and think about what it means to be doing this. I've been part of the YUI team, which we'll be talking about the YUI library, the UI library this afternoon. Kind of split my time between engineering and design, and at the end of the day, figure it's my job to always really defend users. I think that's one of the sort of differences between a front-end engineer and other types of engineers, is that the work we do impacts users directly, and so always really focused on them. So what exactly is front-end engineering? One way to say it is that we're the ones that write software in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And you might think that software development in HTML is sort of an oxymoron, it sort of doesn't make sense. It's just HTML. Fine. But JavaScript, we're writing real software in the browser these days. If you look at something like Google Maps or Yahoo Mail, these are sophisticated software programs that run in the browser that are written almost entirely in JavaScript. Put another way, we're the ones that tell browsers what to do. And if anybody's tried to fix a browser bug ever, you know that that's not as easy as it sounds. And in fact, that's a lot of what we do, is trying to wrangle browsers. Another way to think about it is that we're right in the middle of all the action. We've got big engineering staff, big design staff, and it's sort of web development and front-end engineering that bring those things together. And I think overlooked often is the impact we can have on the strategy of the company, the strategy of our products, the design decisions we make. Because you need to know what's possible in the browser before you can decide what to build, and what's efficient before you decide what to engineer, all these things. And so I've always really enjoyed the fact that we're sort of right in the middle and get to speak all these different languages and interact with all these different teams. Put in even simpler terms, we're the ones responsible for view source. So, we write a lot of back-end code too, but at the end of the day, when you hit view source, that's what front-end engineering is about. Put yet another way, this is sort of the technology stack at Yahoo. We're still pretty much a C++ company at the very low levels for speed. A lot of PHP in the middle. So going down from our core libraries up through our PHP functions and libraries, up to all the business logic layer, getting into display logic and the APIs for moving data around, and then building the actual pages, building the actual modules. Most companies, you can switch out some acronyms, but pretty much all companies look something like this, I think. So there's a pretty easy separation here between what might be on the back end and what might be on the front end. But it's not just about HTML versus C++, because if you look at any of these levels, everybody's writing PHP or JSP or Ruby or whatever your company's working with. So we spend a lot of time doing that, but most of our identity is the things that actually get sent down to the browser. So that sounds pretty simple, perhaps. I would argue no. So if you think about, even if you forget about all the stuff on the back end, even if you forget about all the work we're doing on the server, all the PHP development and data manipulation, just think about the stuff closer to the browser than that. There's a lot of different knowledge areas that we need to have straight in our head. And for each knowledge area, for instance, HTML, there's a lot of different dimensions to that. It's really important to understand the specification. What is HTML? Where does which attributes are available for which elements? What's legit? What can we exploit that we haven't necessarily taken advantage of in the language? But it's not just a spec, as we heard Joe talk about yesterday. It's about what was actually implemented. Standards don't save the day. They're just sort of the starting point. So we need to understand the standards. We also need to understand how Microsoft and Apple and Mozilla and Opera sort of implemented those things. And then, of course, they introduced bugs. And so it's important to understand those. And then sort of through that, we're always searching for a theory and a practice about the best way to bring all this technology to bear. So 4 dimensions just for this single knowledge area. And of course, there's a bunch of them: the document object model, CSS, JavaScript, the APIs to talk to the browser, talk to the documents. And now in the Web 2.0 world, we're doing a lot of data transportation. So we're doing AJAX. We're passing data back and forth to the server. And to make things exciting, we're doing that across 3 operating systems at least, across a bunch of different browsers and versions of browsers on each of those operating systems. So it's not just HTML anymore. It's a whole bunch of things. And here's a little cocktail napkin math for the number of things your local front-end engineer is trying to make sense of every morning with their cup of coffee. Sometimes we feel like this, either before or after coffee. It's like all these things, how do we actually get this site to work? How do we get the site to speed up and to be safer and to be more interactive? So, the alien feels that way, but so does Doug Crockford, who's one of the world's leading experts on JavaScript. He says that browsers are the most hostile software development environment imaginable. And I'm not one to argue with him. But so this was a couple years ago. Since then, to be fair, he said, well, except for mobile. But those are mobile browsers, so I still lump it all together. Well, another plug for this afternoon's talk. This is really exactly why we built the YUI library. We're not trying to change any of these languages. We're just trying to make it a little bit more sane and less painful to develop software for browsers. So I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the distinction between front-end and back-end, some of the challenges unique to front-end engineering, and why it requires a slightly different approach. First of all, we can't compile anything. We're sending code over the wire to the browser, to an unknown browser with unknown configuration. So we can't really trust anything. We can't trust the data we get back. We can't trust the user to have particular software. We can't predict their environment. We don't know which toolbars they have. We don't know if they have various technology turned on and off. We're just driving blind. On the back end, in contrast, you compile it. It's on your server. You control everything. It's a totally different world. We can't install anything. We can't store anything. So every time a user comes to a page or clicks a link, they have to download all that information again. So we always have to be thinking about, when the user comes, this whole bundle is unique every time. We can't download libraries and save all these things. And then, sort of embarrassingly, we can't hide our dirty laundry. You hit view source and you see everything we do. It's all out there. So our exploits are more visible, and some of our shortcomings also. These are the other fun things we get to work on, and this is kind of why I was talking about being in the middle of all those different worlds. It's really fun to play a role in usability, to go into usability labs and to be doing rapid prototyping, to be really focused on performance. We're going to come back to that one. So yeah, there's that again. So these are all some of the reasons why front-end engineering sort of deserves respect in organizations, and it's a really important place to invest in if you want your company and your projects to be successful online. It's a hostile world out there, and you need somebody kind of steering you through it. All right. Did anybody ever buy this book? I think it came out in 1996. What's the tagline there? The Art of Third-Generation Site Design. I actually just bought a copy again. I bought a copy back when it came out and learned a lot from it. I just went back to Amazon, used stores, whatever, and bought another copy just for sort of an historical artifact. And one of the quotes in here that sort of gets me is this one. He writes that the framers of the web saw browser differences as beneficial and believed that visitors should choose how their browser displayed the page. Then he goes on, he says, I wanted more control, so I threw my HTML book in the trash and started from scratch. It might be nice to do that, but that really, I think that's why the web is still a sick place, and we're still sort of recovering from that. I mean, that's why we've spent years getting rid of all that bad markup, rediscovering what JavaScript can do, learning how to bring CSS to bear. And so I think of front-end engineers sort of as the radiologists for the web. We can see inside the web pages, see inside the web applications, and sort of learn, sort of see what's wrong and what needs to be fixed. And therein is sort of one of the challenges organizationally of front-end engineering, because a lot of CEOs can't tell the difference if we're doing Siegel's, third-generation websites from 1996, or a nicely designed website from Web 2.0 10 years later. But it matters. It matters that the insides are healthy, and that's where sort of front-end engineers come to play. And it matters because your value depends on it. At Yahoo, we have a set-top box business and a mobile business, but 99% of the company's value is expressed through a web browser. All the work our engineering staff does is expressed through the fingers of a front-end engineer, and all the designs that we do all this research for and develop and test and iterate upon. Web developers bring those things to life. And so if we become kind of the narrow point that all this has to go through, it's really important to work there. All right, who can tell me what this number is? 55.4 years. We have a guess. It's a tough one. So I just did some little math, arithmetic on the back of the napkin. And you take the number of page views that the Yahoo homepage gets, and if we were able to shave a quarter of a second off the load time of the homepage of Yahoo, we would save the world 55.4 years, person years of time per month, just by making the site a little bit faster. And so we've done that over the years. And so you think about why would you want to have these people really focused on it. I can just fire up a program and chop up this Photoshop file and have a website. What's it matter? Well, it matters because our users are using this site, and we just saved them 55 years of their lifetime just this month. Front-end engineers also have a particular type of power, and I teach all the training classes to all our new hires at Yahoo, all the new engineers we get, and I really try to teach them about this, or instill this belief in them. I think it's really important that we sort of be trendsetters of quality. like I said, the CEO can't always tell the difference between a really high-quality site from a JavaScript layer or from an HTML layer and one that's not. And so it's sort of up to us to do the right thing anyway, but also to sort of educate and to fix things before others ask us to, and really take pride sort of in that layer. I think it's also really important to be belligerent gatekeepers. What I mean here is that web development is often the last step in the process. So the design slips a couple weeks, and the business development slips a couple weeks, and the engineering slips a couple weeks, and the web development at the end, the launch date doesn't slip. And so we're right at the end getting compressed and compressed and compressed. And it's been really important to stand up and say, well, sorry, the site's not the quality we expect yet. It's not in a place that can service the users as well as we need to. So I really try to encourage all the developers at Yahoo to, we sort of have a particular power because you're the last person in that process. You're the last one to touch the code. And therefore, if something bad's on the network, you let it out there. And also, everything kind of ends at you. And so you really need to kind of stand up for that part of the process. When web development first started at Yahoo, like I mentioned at the beginning, we were part of the user experience and design group. We were sort of part of the design organization. And so we were really involved in design prototypes, in usability testing, in sort of the design life cycle of a project. And then a few years later, as the work we were doing became more complex and sort of mission critical, the whole organization moved to be within engineering. When you're doing nested tables and font tags, most back-end engineers can figure out what happens when, the alignment's screwy. They can go add another space or GIF and push it over. But when you're doing things with CSS and with JavaScript, those languages, particularly CSS, aren't as easy to pick up for a lot of engineers. So JavaScript's a programming language, and so if you're a good engineer and you've sort of normalized the browser differences, it's possible to, it's easy to sort of get into it. But CSS, as many of you know, is a totally different mental model. And if you're not familiar with CSS, if you don't know what a float and a clear is, you don't really know what to do, how to fix things. And so organizationally, organizationally at Yahoo, the web developers moved to be within engineering and sort of to report to the engineering manager to be responsible for the site 24/7. And so that really presented a challenge for us because no longer are we sitting with the designers and the user researchers and the design team. And the design team in most organizations are the one that have the passion for the users, for doing right by the user. Engineers don't necessarily across the board have that same training, that same passion to have empathy for users. And because web developers wear both hats, I think it's really important that no matter where you are in the organization, as your organization shifts or not, no matter where you are, it's your job to have really stubborn empathy for the users, to know what's right for them, to care about them, and to be sort of their last advocate. All right, so now I want to shift gears a little bit. Now I kind of set the stage for sort of what it is and why we're doing it and why I think it matters. And I want to talk about a little bit about sort of how we go about it at Yahoo. And hopefully some of this stuff is familiar or exactly how you practice it at your company or in your projects. So over the years, we sort of arrived at sort of 4 guiding principles. The first is availability. Sort of at the end of the day, if our site's not available, if users can't get to our site, there's no point in doing anything else. So rule number 1 is availability. We want to maximize the availability, maximize the accessibility, maximize the utility of content and services for users anywhere in the world. The second one that we've found useful over time is to really keep openness in mind. When I first started at Yahoo in 2001, I came out to a few conferences like these, and I would scrub every mention of Yahoo from my talk because we were sort of secretive and company secrets, and I would just talk about concepts at a higher level. Now, you'll see Yahoo people at most conferences. We're really trying to share what we believe and to help raise the tide for all of us. But openness means a few things. It means within the team, sort of be clear about what you're doing, document what you're doing, share what you're doing, share what you're learning, teach somebody else, advocate for a better way. Because at the end of the day, I think we all benefit from a healthy internet. And I've always said that as a Yahoo employee because we're such a large part of the internet. that, if it's good for the health of the internet, it'll be good for us eventually. And as Yahoo does some of these open source things and some of these other efforts we're working on, some people ask why. And this is always the most honest answer I have, is that I think if it's good for the internet, it's good for us, and that we all win when the internet's a healthier place. So that means things like adopting microformats and supporting fringe browsers and a whole bunch of other things. But so openness. The third is richness, and this isn't news to anybody, I don't think, that in the last 2, 3, 4 years, what's expected of web design has changed significantly. We've gone from really static sites to much more complex and rich behavior sites. We want to do this in a way, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute. We want to do this in a way that gives as much of that richness as possible, but that doesn't interact with rule number 1. Rule number 1 says availability, and so we can't do any richness that reduces overall availability. And so finding that balance is our job. So we want to keep layering on these enhancements, and we're going to talk about progressive enhancements, sort of an approach for doing this. Another thing I try to tell our developers and to you guys is that we're really not the average user. Our office sits on a really fast bandwidth pipe. We've all got nice computers. We all know what to do online, and we can find the button even when it doesn't have the contrast ratio that Lance was advocating for. But so you really want to remember that there's a lot of different types of users out there, and that it's very unlikely that we represent our users. And then the fourth is stability. And so for a lot of companies, this means platforms. This sort of means building layers that are going to persist over time. If you look around Yahoo, you'll find Yahoo websites. You'll find a lot of code that was written 10 years ago, lottery.yahoo.com or parts of Yahoo Pets or sort of some of the backwaters of our network. We wrote those pages a decade ago and have only done minor changes since then. But what sort of that shows is that HTML is sort of here to stay, and that even though we were getting better at our techniques, better at our technology, and browsers are improving, there's a lot of things that can sort of linger. And so you really want to do work now that's going to have that staying power. If you think about something like HTML, even though we hear about XHTML2 and HTML5, I think that the HTML layer we write today will be around in 10 years on a lot of sites. If you get all the presentation, if you get all the behavior out of there, the HTML layer is relatively explicit. It doesn't need to change as much if it's just representing your content. And so, like our executive vice president said, they wanted to sort of invest in the future where the layers were separated, where each one was stronger, because that really opens up the door for doing things in the future that we can't really predict right now. So those are the four kind of driving things we keep in mind when we're trying to make decisions. But then there's three sort of techniques that sort of bring all those together. The first is graded browser support, which sort of frees you to do all these things. Is anybody familiar with that term, graded browser support? A couple people? You can read the white paper I wrote on it there, sort of the definition. But basically what it does is it changes our notion of browser support. So how many people have gone into a client meeting to start a new project or talk to your boss, and the first question was, well, do I have to support IE5 on this project? Or do I have to support Netscape 4 in this project? It was always phrased like a binary question, like, yes or no. Either I'm going to support you or you're not welcome on my site. And so what graded browser support does is say that it's no longer binary, that there can be grades of support. And that also support doesn't mean identical. It's irrational and unhealthy to think that the experience, that every pixel on every browser, on every device should be in the exact same place. That's not what the web is about. And so we really needed to reframe the discussion here. So A, support's not binary, and B, support doesn't mean identical. And so we came up with 3 grades of support. The first is the C grade experience. And this is the lowest level of experience that's really available to everybody. We take a blacklist of incapable browsers that don't understand modern technology like CSS and advanced JavaScript. And we withhold all the CSS and we withhold all the JavaScript from those user agents. And so they just get a nice semantic HTML page with links that let them navigate. At the other end of the spectrum, we keep a whitelist of A-grade browsers. And these are modern browsers that are in wide use. And for these users, we give them all the content. We give them all the HTML. We give them all the CSS. We give them all the JavaScript. And we do a lot of QA testing on these platforms. So we've got a blacklist on one end, a whitelist on the other end, and everything else is the X grade. We don't know what they are. And in fact, at Yahoo, we see about between 10 and 12,000 different browsers a month. And so we've got a handful on the blacklist and a handful on the whitelist, and the other 10,000 are sort of this X grade, and we don't really know about. And so we're optimistic. We haven't assumed that they're bad browsers, and so we still give them all the HTML and CSS and JavaScript. But often we'll give them a little message saying you're sort of on your own. But it's not really that big of a deal because 96, 97% of our browsers are on this A-grade support list. So we're doing the 4 big brands, the modern versions of each across the common operating systems. This represents, like I said, about 96, 97% of our global audience. The C-grade experience, the Netscape 4s of the world, the IE5s of the world, that's another 2%. And then the other 10,000 browsers make up about 1%. So what exactly does this look like? Here's Yahoo search in the C-grade experience. We withhold all the JavaScript. We withhold all the CSS. We just get in, some hierarchy, some H1s, some H2s, some H3s, and then an ordered list of search results. Everything works just fine. It doesn't look the way we expect. And some of the behavior is not there. Up along the top, above the search box, there are the different types of vertical searches, the image search and the news search. On the A-grade experience, if we look here, all the CSS comes in, the JavaScript comes in. Those links above the search box become tabs that do a nice kind of DHTML redesign of the page. And so you're able to give that C-grade experience to anybody in the world and also have this really high fidelity experience for the vast majority of your users. Here's a screenshot from Yahoo Photos, again with all the JavaScript, all the CSS turned off. And I wanted to show this one because this is a more complex page. A search result's a pretty straightforward web page. Photo site's a little more complex. And if you look right underneath the photo there's the 5 links for rating the photo. And they're links that you click that go to the server, that do a page refresh. The server's set up to accept that input, to log that rating. But on the A-grade experience here, we use CSS and we use JavaScript to consume that ordered list and generate on the top right there, sort of the Netflix style hover over DHTML AJAX-based star rating. So you can have all this rich complexity built on top of a dependable core, thereby ensuring that anybody in the world has access to your site, which is our rule number 1, sort of maximum availability. So this is all a type of progressive enhancement. You start with a core and you build your way up. We heard a little bit about graceful degradation yesterday, and I think that progressive enhancement is almost the same thing. It just thinks about it in a different direction. It says that instead of designing our perfect website and then being okay with some things breaking, it says let's design availability first. Let's build our solid core. Let's ensure that everything works, and then let's start to enhance it. So you end up with about the same approach, but we found that structurally and organizationally, this approach really makes sure we focus on the right things at the right time, and that this core experience doesn't get overlooked at the end. So there's really 5 rules of progressive enhancement. First of all, that all content should be enriched with really concise, precise semantic markup. Markup's job is to add meaning to content. It's not concerned with presentation. It's not concerned with anything else. Its job is to add meaning to content. Basic functionality needs to exist for all browsers. So this means that the hrefs need to go somewhere, that the forms need to submit, just the core functionality. Obviously, the drag and drop's not going to work at this layer, but you should still be able to click around, submit a search, compose an email. Then we bring in external CSS files to enhance the visual design and external JavaScript files to enhance the behavior of the site. And it's important to always respect sort of the end user preferences. Users can toggle the size of their page. They can adjust the font size. They can adjust their local CSS to have a different contrast. And we never want to do anything that reduces user choice. So like I said, it's really graceful degradation just sort of flipped. So a way to frame the conversation a little bit differently, and in my opinion, in a more healthy way, because it ensures that instead of as an afterthought, that we're doing this right from the beginning. And some people think that this takes a lot more work, but I've sort of found that that's actually not true, that in fact, by having this C-grade experience, you're able to validate that your database is storing data correctly right at the beginning. You're able to validate that the form is there, that it's detecting required fields right at the beginning. Before you've brought on the JavaScript or the CSS, you know that the site basically works. And so then you've already isolated problems when they arise later. If I add the DHTML rating widget and all of a sudden the database isn't storing that rating anymore, I know what layer that's happening in and I can go fix it. Unobtrusive JavaScript is sort of a similar approach, but really focused on behavior itself. This is, I think, the quintessential article on unobtrusive JavaScript. In fact, I think if you do a search for that string, you'll end up at that link. So Christian sort of outlined sort of 6 rules for this in that paper and sort of in the material around it. First of all, you never want to add JavaScript directly to the page. Second, you can never depend on JavaScript. You can never assume it's going to be there, nor can you really assume it's going to be secure. It's important that it always is just sort of an enhancement. Like all these layers are enhancements, but with JavaScript particularly, many users have JavaScript turned off, and it's also a very sort of insecure language. And so anything you do in JavaScript, you need to be sure to validate on the server side. You can never trust the input from JavaScript. Anybody want to guess what % of the internet users have JavaScript turned off? It's actually sort of a difficult stat to get because a lot of detection strings use JavaScript to sort of figure it out. But we found that it's somewhere between 8 and 10% sort of globally. And so how much time, who spent time in the last week tweaking something for a Mac browser? And Mac browsers represent maybe 3 to 4% of the audience. So ideally, you're spending 2 to 3 times the amount of time you're spending supporting Mac, supporting all your users that don't have JavaScript turned on. And of course, it changes depending on your market, depending on your user profile, but it's not insignificant. When you're actually going through and writing JavaScript, it's really a best practice to, before you access a particular JavaScript object, to just do a quick test to make sure it's there, and just fail right away if it's not. So that way you're really setting your JavaScript up to really be defensive from the beginning. Another thing we really try to do all the time, and that I think is the best practice, is to write JavaScript itself. Get out of the habit of writing any language or any browser-specific dialect of JavaScript. Don't go in and actually change what JavaScript is. We just try to, if you look through the YUI library, we're not trying to pollute the meaning of JavaScript. We're just trying to clean up some of the browser differences. That way all of our developers can just write pure JavaScript instead of learning some particular browser dialect of it. Be very careful not to hijack other scripts' variables. You want all of your scripts to be really sort of independent and isolated, to not pollute the global namespace, and to not sort of get in the way or depend on any of these other sort of moving parts. And then finally, don't really bind any of your events. JavaScript's all about event-based interfaces, but make sure that those events aren't bound to the mouse. Almost every event, if you look at a mouse hover, that could be a focus event for the keyboard user. Or on key press or on submit instead of on mouse down or something like this. Just make sure that you're not binding your entire interface to the use of a mouse. You see a lot of people on laptops who spend more time on the keyboard than on the mouse, in addition to all the accessibility community needs. I want to call these 3 things out particularly. These are sort of my 3 pet peeves of the day. href equals pound is breaking the web. Hrefs are supposed to go somewhere, and href pound goes nowhere. And so you're breaking the web. And what a lot of times people are doing is they're doing href equals pound, and then they're bringing JavaScript in later to add an event handler to navigate somewhere. Or they're doing it right in the pseudo protocol. They're writing href equals JavaScript. But so for 10% of the web out there, including Google and Yahoo search engines, the Google bot doesn't really understand JavaScript that well yet. And so if your navigation is based on JavaScript : the search engines can't navigate that in most cases. And even inline things like onClick, we want to get those out of there. We want to attach JavaScript from an external file with JavaScript to the page. So when I'm doing code reviews around Yahoo, I always ding people for these things most of all. All right, shift gears again and talk about performance. So, we're really focused on the speed of websites, and users really like fast websites. And my colleague at Yahoo, Steve Souders, recently wrote this book for O'Reilly called High Performance Websites that puts in one place all the research we've done over the last 4 years at Yahoo into this. You can find most of that research at that URL there. The most impressive thing we found out is that 80% of the end user response time is based on front-end code decisions. So I'm sure many of you have launched a new site, and the CEO says, wow, that site's slow, or the engineering manager says that site's slow. And so you spend a lot of time optimizing SQL queries, or you buy more hardware, and you put more memory in your servers, or you buy another server. Turns out you can do everything you want there, and on a normal, well-tuned, decently tuned site, that's only going to impact 20% of the total speed of the site. 80% of the site comes from HTTP requests, from waiting for HTML and JavaScript and image files to download. And so everything we can do, there's just a lot more low-hanging fruit when it comes to speeds of sites from front-end engineering efforts than from back-end engineering efforts. So we've published some research on some of the more interesting things here. First, about that same 80% rule, why 80, sort of the 80-20 rule that we see pop up all the time, and why that's true when it comes to performance. We've done a bunch of research into the way browser caches actually work. You hear a lot of people talk about external CSS files get downloaded once and then never downloaded again. Turns out that's, sadly, not very true. In fact, only about 60% of our users, even on the homepage of Yahoo, where users often have it saved as their homepage or coming back multiple times per day, only 60% of all those users benefit from a primed cache. 40% of the users, even on their second visit, don't have anything in their cache. So it's not as dependable as we thought. Anyway, so you can read about that research there. We've enumerated or listed out 34 different rules for performance. But the top 4 are by far the most important. The first is to radically reduce the number of HTTP requests your page makes. So every CSS file you're including, every image you're including, all of these dramatically slow down your page. And if you do one thing, if you just reduce the number of HTTP requests on your page, you'll actually, to a human eye, be able to see a faster site. The 2 best ways to do that are to combine files. And so you should only really have one JavaScript file and one CSS file on your page. And then the second way to do that is in the world of images, is to use something like CSS Sprits to combine many images into a single HTTP request. We've published a little bit of information about ways you can configure your server to maximize the amount of caching that happens. As you're combining files, we also want to minimize those files and then serve them with gzip compression from the server if we can. And then the fourth one is sort of interesting. We found that if you go to, if you're reading up on web development, in the head of the document, you put your link for your CSS file and your script source for your JavaScript file. We found out that actually putting your JavaScript at the very bottom of your document is much, much faster. So we put the JavaScript, the JavaScript include right before the closing body tag, and the page loads a lot faster. How many people are familiar with CSS Sprites, use them on their sites? About a third, maybe. So we'll just go through this quickly here. I want to save some time for questions. So this is basically the idea of sprites. So the yellow box here is just my DOM node. Think of it as my navigation. If I have a navigation list on the side of my page, this is just one of those entries. And then on the left there is my background image with the 3 different stars. So I could have 3 different images and put a different image inside each node, inside each navigation item. Or I could have one image and put it inside each of them and change the positioning. And so that's what CSS Sprites is about. It's about taking many small images, including it in one big file, and then exposing just a portion of it through CSS positioning of that image. So here, if I attach that image just to my node, my yellow box, using that CSS down there at the bottom, background equals image, it's just going to repeat across the page. And so the first thing I do is I turn off repeat. Now I've only got it on there once. And so if I'm looking at that yellow box, all I can see is that blue star. The other 2 are outside of that box, and so they're not going to show up. And so if I change the positioning of that background image, if I move it up 100 pixels, now all of a sudden the yellow star is showing up instead of the blue one. I can move it up a little bit further, and now I've exposed the green star. And so using that one image, the one image file, I have 3 different images to choose from. And so I can take 3 different boxes, use that image each time, and just change the positioning a little bit for each of those boxes. Very simple technique, but it lets you do things like take 78 different image icons from the Yahoo homepage and have it be one HTTP request. I mean, and that's seconds off the load time. And we talked about why these things matter. I mean, that alone saves years of person time per month. All right, now I just want to rattle through a couple more takeaways, things that we've sort of been doing lately. The first is you hear a lot of discussion about HTML versus XHTML versus other sort of languages. Here I'm not going to get into all the rationale. I just wanted to spend a few minutes at the end talking about some of the things we do at Yahoo. We pretty much write HTML 4.01 strict. We use that doc type. Which doc type you use isn't super important, but using one is important because it triggers the rendering mode in the browser. Browsers have Quirks mode and Standards mode. The Standards mode follows the rules a lot better, is much more predictable. And the browser has both modes, and you opt in to the more Standards mode by having a doc type present. Some people ask, well, why not XHTML? And this link down here at the bottom has the best answer I've ever seen. It's a survey of all the research around HTML versus XHTML. I don't think there's anything wrong with XHTML. I've just never felt compelled to take us there. And in fact, now that we see HTML5 coming in quicker than XHTML2, I feel like maybe our conservative approach will prove useful in the end. We heard about this yesterday in Dan's talk about CSS, about how he likes to arrange it, at the end of the day, all in one line. And also, the reason I like to do it this way is because when you read down that left rail there, you can see all the rules that impact the more section of the page. You can see all the rules that are talking about the sidebar of the page. And the way that the selectors get more specific is the way they sort of indent. It's almost like reading nicely tabbed code. You can see as it gets further indented, it means it's sort of more precise. So it's sort of just visually, it makes it easier for me in most cases to kind of read through a CSS file. So this is the way most of our developers are writing CSS now. A lot of discussion about CSS hacks and filters and which ones are okay and which files should you put them in. And again, a lot of this stuff is open for debate. I just want to share the way we do it. First of all, we try to think about what are the acceptable characteristics, or what are the characteristics of an acceptable CSS hack. First of all, we want it to be recognized and easily identifiable as a hack. We don't want it to be like, what is that again? Why is that in there? We want it to be obvious that this is sort of a CSS hack, well known. We decided that we wanted to be really close to the rule it modifies. So instead of putting it in an external file with another HTTP request that we need to remember to change when the width of an element gets changed in a redesign, we decided we wanted everything sort of in one place. We wanted to choose hacks and filters that have very minimal side effects, that are really tailored just to fix their problem, that are as forward-thinking as possible, and that are unaffected by reasonable build processes and reasonable code compression. And so we really only use 3 CSS filters for 95% of our development. The first one is to trigger the hasLayout property, or the hasLayout sort of mode for IE browsers. hasLayout is an internal to IE notion of how certain things flow. It's not in any of the specs. It's just the weird way IE rendering engine works. And so a lot of times, if you've ever fixed a bug by putting height equals 1%, or floating something left, or making something position relative just to get it to work better in IE, what you were probably doing behind the scenes was triggering this sort of hasLayout mode. And we found that using Zoom 1 is the best way to do that, because A, it's right there. B, it's sort of when it doesn't do anything except trigger this mode. Zoom 1 equals 100%, which is just normal. And so by setting Zoom 1, which isn't supported in any browser, in 5 years when it is supported, it won't have any impact. So it's very it'll sort of neutralize itself over time. More interestingly is how to filter between IE 6 and 7 and sort of IE in general. So this first rule here goes to all browsers. All browsers get height equals 100 pixels. We use the underscore property filter to send a rule just to IE 6 and 7. And then the star property filter to send a rule just to IE 7. So using that combination, you can overwrite the ones that came before it. All browsers get 100%. If it's IE 6 or 7, they can understand the second rule and it changes it to 101. And if it's IE 7, it can overwrite that and change the property again. So since IE represents most of our development time in terms of CSS, this three-rule system here is really effective in sort of wrangling it into shape. It's true that these things don't validate, that if you run your CSS through a validator, all of these three things we just talked about will throw errors. And if that's really important to you, then putting them in an external file and pulling it in with conditional comments is a fine way to go. In our opinion, in my opinion, the reduced HTTP requests is more important than a clean validation report. And so we usually put these things right in line, or right where they belong with the other rules. One thing we've been putting a lot of time into lately is our build processes. You know, as web development moves from simple content markup and visual decoration to really software engineering, it's important that our processes sort of grow in sophistication at the same time. We found Apache Ant is the best tool for doing sort of front-end based build processes, although there's many good tools out there. And my colleague Julian has written up a great blog post about how to set up an Ant build process. But what it lets us do, this is some screenshots from the YUI library, is it lets us have 3 different versions, or a lot of different versions of each file. So you can have development that's based on lots of individual files, and then a build process that pulls things together. And so all the files in YUI have 3 different versions. They have a fully commented development version. This is what we build when we're writing the library. Lots of comments, lots of spacing, lots of tabbing, really easy to understand. Then we have a different version that has a lot of debug information put in there. So when you're in development mode, you toggle the debug version, and now you're getting more logger output, you're getting more development queues. But then when it comes time to send things down to the user, we do a compression step, a concatenation step, strip out all the comments, strip out all the white space, make things very small, and send it over the wire. I was going to talk about Firebug and why slow, but I think I'm going to save those for this afternoon and take a few minutes of questions. We got about 8 minutes left, I think. So I'm going to end right here, and thank you for your time, and ask for some questions, please. So the question is, when you're actually doing a page layout and you have a table that you're trying to indent, it responds differently in IE than it does in Firefox? So one thing we've discovered over time, or that I personally believe, is that, and we heard a little bit of this yesterday in some of the sessions, is that it's really effective to develop in the most standard environment possible first. And so what that means for us is to develop for Firefox or perhaps Safari first, and then patch the other browsers. So even though a majority of our users are still using IE, and that's kind of our target audience, we really want to do our development work to the spec and then patch the other browsers. Otherwise, you end up in this world where you've made all these accommodations, you've made all these kind of compromises, and then you have to undo those compromises to fit the standards. So that's one answer, is to try to get it working in Firefox and then do a few of the known accommodations that you need to make for IE. The other thing is to consider like a CSS reset file, which tries to neutralize some of the differences between browsers right from the beginning. So there's one of those in YUI, there's one of those from Eric Meyer, Temtech has one, there's a bunch of them floating around. What those aim to do is just to remove the browser basis. Each browser has a different CSS definition for all the HTML elements. So the height of an H2, the padding between cells in a table. What a reset file does is neutralize all of those, so you're starting fresh. But then you can add in the spacing you want, the indentation you want. So I guess those would be my 2 recommendations. Start from the standards approach, and if you're having trouble wrangling CSS across browsers, start by neutralizing it and then building up exactly what you need. Question here.
You mentioned CSS Sprits.
Yeah.
And providing images to reduce HTTP requests. Would you do the same thing for external images? I mean, images that are just right there on the page?
It's a great question. It's a great question. What about CSS Sprites for sort of content images? CSS is the decoration language. CSS is the presentation layer. If your image is content, it belongs in the content layer. So if you're building a news site and you have a news headline or a news image, that's part of the news story. That belongs in the HTML. If you're doing all the headshots of your executives, for your corporate site, that's the content. So that belongs in the HTML. The only images we put in CSS, and therefore the only ones that are spriteable, are the rounded corners and the icons and the decorative images. If you're still trying to squeak out more performance from your site, there's a piece of the YUI library called the YUI image loader. And what that lets you do is lets you set of all your content images. Say you have a long travel site, and it was developed by our travel team initially. You have a long travel site. You've got lots of pictures of Chicago. And the page isn't done loading until it's loaded all these pictures, even though the folds is way up here. And so what you can do with the image loader is you can say, don't load all these images until the page has started to scroll. So you can sort of do on-demand loading and really fine-tune your site. So if you really need to squeak more performance out of content images, that might be an approach to go. But in general, your question hinted at the answer, that if it's content images, it belongs in HTML.
Actually, I was thinking, most of the time, people take a large image and cut it up and try and re-piece it together. Is that something that advocated?
You mean for like a large masthead image or something like that? Yeah, I don't know. It sort of depends. If you look at a lot of like blog templates, you can have any masthead image you want, and most of the time that's a background image behind the H1 for the page. So sort of the same thing. I don't know why. I'd have to look at the actual design to see why it was being cut up, and sort of what markup nodes that it was being reattached to. But in general, if it's coming in from CSS, then the sprites can be effective. A couple more questions. I saw a hand before. Over here. Yeah. So how do you handle varying text size in CSS sprites? So in the example we showed there, I was moving it 100 pixels at a time to expose a different star. In CSS, you can use ems. You can use some proportional unit. So a lot of times, if I knew it was 1 em off and my font size was 1 em, then as the font size increases, the node is going to sort of move at the same time. But when you're actually laying out your sprite graphic, it's important to keep that in mind. In the simple example I showed, we had the image right next to each other, so there wasn't any breathing space. And if you look at actual real-world sprites, a lot of times there'll be 200 pixels of white space between each image. That doesn't really add to the file size because of the way compression works. All that white space will just get compressed. But it does give your image room to move so that as the node sort of expands, it doesn't expose the other image you didn't want it to. But yeah, so short answer is just using relative positioning sizes like ems. In back here. That's a good question. If you're building out a new team, do you pull from your designers or do you pull from your engineers? I don't know. I think both to some extent. We definitely have people on our front end teams that come from a backend world and that really focus on like a lot of our JavaScript software. And we've got people who come from our design world that have that strong user empathy and that eye for design, that eye for pixel precision. Both those skills are important. So if you can get sort of a balanced team, that's good. But I think it's really it can be anybody. a lot of the engineering skills that are important are learnable. You know, especially now that we've got abstraction layers for a lot of different browsers in terms of JavaScript. Actually, writing JavaScript is much more rational now than it was a few years ago. CSS is still, I think, one of the trickier aspects. And so both sides are going to have to sort of meet on that one. But it's a blend. It's a hybrid craft. You know, you need to have the understanding of the code, and you also have to have that really strong user empathy. So I think if you pull from either place, you'll be well positioned. Anybody else? Let's see. So I just have I threw some business cards up here if anybody wants to grab one. I'd love to keep talking to you guys later. You can track me down at that email address or on my blog. And, I'm Nate Koechley on pretty much every web service out there like Twitter and everything else. So I hope to see you soon. Thanks a lot. See you this afternoon.